Hello and welcome to the 2021 12D Tech Forum. Today's presentation will be covering 12D Synergy and the ISO 19650 overview. My name's Blake Feehely. I'm the Transport Digital Engineering Manager at Cardno, based out of the Sydney St Leonard's office. My background is in CAD, document control, and some experience in GIS systems. Cardno, if you may or may not know, is a global infrastructure, environmental and social development company. We're based out of Australia, Queensland, and we were founded in 1945. We're currently situated in approximately 100 countries, and we're an approximate of 4,000 staff. We're also ISO 9001 accredited. For today's agenda, we'll be first covering what ISO 19650 is in our context, some of the pertinent points around the ISO spec. Secondly, we'll go through an overview of ISO 19650 and 12D Synergy and implementing it in that environment. We'll then move to how we manage information and data in 12D Synergy in line with ISO 19650 principles. We'll discuss some of the enhancements and possible considerations in implementing ISO 19650. And then we'll go through a wrap-up together, what content we've covered, and some of the considerations and points to take from today's session. Firstly, it's important to consider where ISO 19650 fits in an overall operational organizational management structure and where it sits with respect to the other ISO standards. As you can see on screen, it's really only a piece of the puzzle, and this piece of the puzzle relates to the delivery phase, or the design phase as we refer to it. Some considerations, if you will, in this piece of the puzzle is that we start the design, we develop the design, and we issue the design. And in other words, we create, we coordinate, and we complete. To take those terms into an ISO 19650 terminology, we work on information, we create information, then we share that information with our wider team and review it. And finally, we issue that information to our client. And so moving through this piece of the puzzle, that's the progression of our information. That's how we manage the information within the ISO 19650 framework. Some important considerations, however, as we consider the implementation of ISO 19650, are a series of acronyms or concepts. And today we're going to focus primarily on two, the PIR and the EIR. And the PIR relates to project information requirements, and the EIR relates to exchange information requirements. Firstly, with PIR, it's really a question from a project level, what it is we need to do. Secondly, it considers the information related to the design against some project brief. And lastly, what information is needed to build the asset. Fairly fundamental building blocks, which is typically considered in the approach to a design and the delivery of a design. The second consideration is the exchange information requirements. And whilst this is typically considered or applied to what exchange format is required on a particular project, it really goes a bit deeper than that, in that we should consider technically what are we going to do to address the PIR. Secondly, when are we to do it? So are the activities on a project periodic or are they singular? Do they happen once? The last consideration to help contextualize EIR is how do we share or exchange this information to get our end result of delivery? Moving from that point, it's important to consider the CDE, and ISO 19650 really talks to the concept of a CDE, otherwise known as a common data environment. And in the context of today's presentation, we're essentially saying that 12D synergy is synonymous with the idea of a CDE. And essentially, a common data environment is a single point of truth environment, an area where we know and have assurance that the information we use is current, is relevant, and can be applicable to tasks and activities on a project. Where ISO 19650 helps us add some color to the picture is it treats information in this single point of truth in terms of states of information. And if you recall from an earlier slide, we spoke about the concept of working on some piece of information or creating some piece of information. Then we spoke about how we need to share that information with our wider team, or essentially share. And finally, how we issue that information to our client. And those concepts put into ISO 19650 terms is our work in progress, our shared, and our published. As we'll find out later in the presentation, there is a fourth state, and that state is archive, but we'll cover the idea of archived when we get to that point in time. Another way to consider the state of our information within our CDE is essentially containers. So containers of work in progress information, containers of shared information, and containers of published information. And this breakdown helps us visualize the translation of all information in one environment, one single point of truth, into the state of information and into the segregation of that information, which is a reflection of the state. To help put this into perspective on a project lifecycle, if we consider the project commencing and project complete, what activities occur with information between those 2 points? And we know that we work on a document or a series of documents or some information, and that information typically evolves from when we start our project all the way to when we complete a project. And this applies to drawings, reports, models. Whether or not we issue this information for particular design milestones, the point is, as we go along that path, we share the results of our design essentially, and we review it a number of times, the result of which gets fed back into the evolution of that original document. Following that, we essentially issue that information to the client, or in other terms, we publish that information. And this is a reflection in a workflow context of how those states or containers can be applied. To assist in understanding the concept of the containers, we've used this excerpt from the ISO 19650 document to better visualize what it is we're trying to do with our information. And if we start from the top right-hand side of the screen, we can see in the blue containers, we essentially have task teams or siloed activities, which could be broken down by discipline, for example. These tasks happen in isolation simply because the development of that information, whether that be a document, a model, or otherwise, still requires input only at that disciplinary level. In other terms, the value of input from the wider team cannot yet be realized, is not yet potentially applicable. And so the siloing of tasks to potentially a discipline in a work in progress state therefore makes sense. Once we have that information developed to a certain point, thinking back to our workflow demonstration from project commence to project complete, we then want to invite comment. We want to consider the wider context of what information we're creating or what design we're developing. And so we change the state of that information to a shared state, and we move that information to a shared container. And it's in that area of our CDE where we receive comment and review on the information we've been developing and take into consideration the outputs of that review and feed that back in to the development of our document, our model, and so on. As you recall in the previous slide, we also get to a point in our delivery where we need to provide that information to the client. We need to issue it or publish it. And so the movement of our information, right, whether that be a drawing, model, or otherwise, needs to be located in a container which reflects the state of that information, which tells us that this information is being released to our client. And this is where the published container makes sense. Finally, we have our archive container or state, and this essentially provides us with a snapshot in time of information which is controlled and, in layman's terms, read-only. We can go back and check the information that has been archived, and we know the state of that information. Now to move into a 12D synergy context, to visualize this in a folder representation or a folder hierarchy, we can see on the screen an example of the information related to a project broken down into these containers. And we can see as we move down the folder hierarchy, the breakdown of what types of information we might have related to that state. And we can see here in a report example, we may have some information related to the roadworks of our project. If we were to inspect that document within our CDE, we would see some information or metadata about that document. And it's here where we link the state of the document with its container. The concept behind linking metadata to a document's property or attribute can be done so, by example, in how we manage changes to the document and the attributes that we apply to the document in the CDE. And what you can see here is an example about how this might be achieved in the 12D Synergy environment. And essentially what we have here is a list of options which relate the state that we want to apply to a document with respect to the container in which it sits in our CDE. Here I'd like to transfer over to a follow-along example in our example project or job in 12D Synergy. Here we can see on screen a very simple folder structure underneath an example job. And in our recent slide, we spoke about the concept of a roadworks report sitting within our work in progress container. And you can see that here. You can see that the state of that document relates to essentially the container in which it sits. And that tells us that this information is essentially in draft. It's in a work in progress state. The way we share this information with the rest of the team is by changing the state and therefore the container in which this document lives, thereby segregating the contents of this document out from the shared contents with the rest of the team. And as I move along to the left-hand side here, we can see that I've located this document in a review folder. And this document in the shared container has a state about it which indicates that it is for sharing, i.e. to welcome, review, and comment. And so comments about this document can be contained to the document in a shared state. The resulting review and the necessary changes for this particular document would then be fed back into our work in progress document. And so essentially our shared document is a snapshot in time, perhaps against some program deliverable or milestone, but as we progress the work in progress document is no longer a current representation of that document. This process may repeat once or it may repeat multiple times. Once we've reviewed for the final time the contents of our shared report, bearing in mind that the version and/or revision of this document can increase to whatever number or value, there will be ultimately final changes as a result of this passed back into our work in progress document. And this aligns with the concept that the document in our work in progress container, as you can see from the left-hand side hierarchy, evolves from project commencement to project completion. Finally, when we choose to release this information to our client or publish it, we then have to change the state of this document, i.e. move it to the necessary container within our folder hierarchy. And so along the left, I'll minimize our shared container and I'll maximize our published container. And we can see here a far more simple breakdown of what our published container might look like. And it essentially contains only the information related to our final delivery, i.e. our final deliverables, not necessarily work in progress documents or information which contribute to the design development. So in this case, we have a series of different packages or disciplinary deliverables groups for our design submission phase X. And following on from just to the left-hand side here in our reviews, the management of documents about the same phase or information about the same phase, phase X, we have reflected that same hierarchy in our published area or container. And so I'll maximize that to our reports area. This is a nominal breakdown of information related to some submission, but this breakdown could be any way a particular organization likes to manage its information about some submission. What I'll now move to, however, is that same report in its published state. And we can see here that that's confirmed by the metadata about this project document, keeping in mind that the metadata is housed and managed within 12D Synergy, our CDE. One added advantage around segregating our information by container is we have the ability now to invite our client to have access to this particular container within our job hierarchy. It also means that we potentially can offer our client limited access to our shared container within our project hierarchy. And we've provided an example. If I minimize our published and our work in progress containers, we've provided an example in our shared container or shared information state, some examples where a client might like to see information in a shared state, but not necessarily in its final or issued state. This information may relate to data drops, for example. Conversely, we also have an exchange area whereby we may be able to receive information from our client also in a shared state. Just to revisit this document, the intention of the work along was to help contextualize how these containers may be arranged in a real case on a job. Again, we spoke about the archive state. This state is very important, and this allows us to be auditable and to be able to track the information in our common data environment. Similarly, we can do so for information in a published state, shared, and work in progress. Some considerations with implementing ISO 19650 in the context of 12D synergy and the functionality that we're provided is perhaps consider how the management of information in these containers could follow some rules and how this could be incorporated, or these rules be incorporated into some workflow such that it could integrate with some QA or QC system. Could there be some benefits realized? Additionally, from a tasks perspective, consider how might the tracking of actionable items in Synergy, or our CDE, could be linked to the state of a document or some piece of information. Could we decide to do task A or B based on the state of the document? Could we choose to edit it or make some disciplinary specific task or action? Or can we treat the document based on its particular state, whether that be shared, and set about some actionable items for that document in that state, i.e. a review? A wrap up to today's presentation is essentially ISO 19650 tells us we should manage information by its state of use. We spoke a lot about work in progress, shared, published, and archived, and it's important on our projects, as we know, to use this information for its intended objective. ISO 19650 gives us a framework to do this. We can also mitigate the responsibility of information by its container or state, enabling a responsibility matrix to better be implemented and followed. In layman's terms, having the right project personnel use and manage information based on its state. We also can see from using containers that shared information reduces producing of coordinated information. And finally, as we spoke about our different containers, and particularly the archive state or container, we have an auditable trail of the information produced, available during and after project delivery, and also asset management activity. Finally, thank you for your time today. We hope you found this presentation informative around the ISO 19650 principles.